In this presentation, we're going to be talking about medieval West Africa and focusing on African geography. So Africa has four main vegetation zones. It could be divided up by desert, Sahel, savanna, and forest. This is a nice old map of Africa. So the different types of geography affect West Africa because the different types of food can grow in these four different zones. People had to trade to get things that they couldn't produce in their own zone. For example, if you lived in the desert, you'd need to trade with somebody who lived in the Sahel or savanna to get the goods that could only grow there. So the first one, like I mentioned, was the desert. And 1/3 of the continent is covered by desert, and it wasn't good for much except for maybe some salt. So if you lived in the desert, you'd most likely be a salt trader, or you'd go into the desert if you needed to acquire some salt. The next area is the Sahel. The Sahel is kind of on the border of the desert. They call it the semi-desert. It's in between the desert and the grasslands. In this picture here, you can see some boys playing soccer. The ground looks dry, but in the background you see some grasslands, maybe some green, but very few. The next would be the savanna. Savanna is like the flat grasslands where it has tall grasses. You see a lot of the National Geographic photos of wildlife where they're in the savanna, where the giraffe walking across the sunset. All those take place in the savanna. Here you'd grow grains, you'd maybe get some trees for building houses. Most people would typically like to live near the savanna. And then you have the forest or the jungle. This is where big trees grow. Obviously you have a lot of green, shrubs, underbrush. You might be able to go there if you're looking for some oil palms, certain roots like yams, cola trees, mahogany, and teak, really expensive woods. And so when you see in the news people harvesting or deforesting areas of Africa's forests, they're looking for those really valuable woods like mahogany and teak. So the earliest communities in West Africa were centered around one family, and these are called family-based communities. But then extended families began to join together and form larger communities where there would be 3, 4, 5 large families living in one area. This would allow them to have more power to control the rivers. They could go out ironing, mining for iron and gold, and it offered them more protection. And so the oldest man living in this community would become the male elder. And they typically were able to make most of the decisions for the entire community. It wasn't until the invention of iron tools that communities were able to go from these family-based towns into larger areas where they could actually provide for themselves. Think back to medieval Europe, where it was the invention of farming tools that allowed them to have a surplus of goods and then could specialize in a particular product or particular good. And so here, for example, is an iron plow. This is a little bit more modern, obviously, than medieval, but it's the same idea where they could clear large areas of land and grow crops a lot more efficiently. So in these towns, you started to see people develop trades or crafts where people would do pottery or weaving or metalworking. That's because the farming was able to be handled by a fewer number of people. And so you get this specialization, this independence, or this ability to live and provide for yourself and take your surplus and trade for goods that you want. So a lot of these villages were located along rivers or other trade routes, and soon along the Niger River these places became to be trading centers or hubs. And right at the intersections of major rivers you would get these communities which were perfect for farming. As you can see in this picture of the Niger River, they're able to carve out canals that could easily pull in the water from the river to supply their crops. And you could tell that it's much easier to live near something like this than what you saw a couple slides back in the middle of the desert. So with all of this, with the specialization, with the small families coming together and forming larger communities, you started to see kingdoms rise. So soon, big trading centers like the city of Timbuktu were able to start taxing the people that lived there or the people that were coming through. So, for example, if they were salt miners up in the north and they were traveling down, they would have to pay taxes to go through the trading center of Timbuktu. Or there was gold miners coming from the south traveling up north. They'd also have to pay taxes. So it was really easy for them to make a lot of money because everybody wanted to go through these trading centers. So there was some advantages, obviously, and some disadvantages to being in a central area or in a kingdom. Some of the advantages were that you had the ability to trade safely. You knew that you were going to be protected. And often the armies would protect you from outsiders or raiders coming in and wanting to take over your stuff. Wars between small cities kind of went away. This was a big area. You no longer had those tribes that were fighting over each other for smaller areas of land because there was one central ruler. However, some of the disadvantages were that the people that lived in those areas that had been conquered by the larger kingdom had to pay tribute. And so many of those people that lived in those smaller family-based communities had to pay tribute to this big kingdom, and they didn't want to, and they had to serve in the army, and they didn't want to do that. And so it created this system of, resentment, people not wanting to be a part of it. So that's kind of an introduction of not only African geography, but also the medieval West African unit. Coming up next we're going to be focusing on two of the major empires, the Empire of Ghana, and then soon thereafter the Empire of Mali. So stay tuned.